There are places in this world where silence feels alive, where the air feels heavy and the trees seem to breathe. Deep in the heart of Appalachia, there are stories most people won't tell out loud, of voices that whisper from the woods, lanterns that move through the fog, and footsteps that stop just behind you. Tonight, we're descending into those woods together. These are true-style encounters and told by people who swore they'd never go back. Campers, travelers, and locals, each one carrying a memory they wish they could forget. So before we begin, make sure you like this video, subscribe to Fear Spiral, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from, the woods, the city, or somewhere in between. Because tonight, no matter where you are, something might be listening. This is Fear Spiral, and these are 10 creepy forest encounters from deep Appalachia. Turn off the lights, put on your headphones, and whatever you do, don't follow the sound of the lantern. The lantern in the trees. It's been almost 8 years since that night, and I still can't sleep whenever the wind moves through the trees. I was 23 then, a park ranger stationed in a remote section of the Appalachian Mountains somewhere between West Virginia and Kentucky. My shift usually started around 4 p.m. and went until midnight, but that week I'd volunteered for the overnight watch. The idea was to monitor an old fire lookout area that had recently been reopened for hikers. I'd been in that region long enough to know the local stories, things about lights moving through the trees at night, or strange cries that weren't animal or human. Most of us brushed those off as superstition, but deep down everyone knew the woods out there had a personality. It wasn't evil exactly, just old. That particular night in late October, the temperature had dropped below freezing, and fog had rolled in thick enough to make the flashlight beam look like a sword cutting through milk. Around 2:30 a.m., I was finishing a patrol loop when I saw something I can't unsee to this day. I was walking a narrow trail that followed a small ridge. The trees on both sides pressed close, oaks and maples with bare winter arms creaking against one another. I stopped for a second to listen. The forest was dead silent except for my own boots crunching frost. No crickets, no owls, just cold air and stillness. Then about 50 yards ahead through the fog, I saw a faint orange glow. At first I thought maybe some hiker had made camp illegally in the restricted area. I remember muttering, "Great, another one," and started walking faster. But the light didn't behave like a fire. It was moving, floating almost. I stopped again and squinted. It looked like a lantern, one of those old-fashioned kinds with a handle and a flickering flame inside. It swayed slightly like someone was carrying it down the trail ahead of me. I radioed in, "Dispatch, this is Unit 4. I think we've got someone out past Ridgepoint Trail. You have any hikers logged in this area tonight?" The radio crackled back, static and nothing else. I tried again, louder this time. Still static. Now I've had my radio fail in storms, but that night the sky was clear. The fog just hung low. I started toward the light again, calling out, "Hey, you can't be out here this late." The light didn't stop. It drifted a little to the left, down the slope between the trees. I followed, using my flashlight to scan ahead, but every time I looked directly at the lantern, it seemed just out of reach. That's when I realized there were no footsteps. The ground was frozen. Every step I took crunched and echoed, but from whoever or whatever and carried that lantern, there was nothing. I remember my heart picking up. "Hello?" I shouted again. "Do you need help?" The light stopped. Dead still, maybe 30 feet ahead. It just hung there, glowing behind a curtain of thin branches. I took a few cautious steps forward. My flashlight beam trembled on the fog, and when I finally brought it to the lantern, there was no one holding it. It floated maybe 5 feet off the ground, swaying slowly from side to side. The fire inside flickered like a real flame. I stood frozen, breath catching in white clouds, trying to make sense of it. Then it moved toward me, not fast but steady, gliding through the air, right through the trees without touching a single branch. I stumbled backward, tripping over a root, my flashlight flying out of my hand. I scrambled to grab it, heart hammering, and when I shined it back up, the lantern was gone, but the air had changed. It was colder, heavy in my chest like the oxygen had been sucked out. Then I heard a sound, a low, raspy whisper, right behind me. "Don't follow." It wasn't loud, but it was close enough that I felt the warmth of breath on my neck. I spun around, swinging the light in every direction. Nothing. Just fog, trees, and silence. I ran. I don't remember half the trail back. Branches slapped my face, my lungs burned, and I kept feeling like something was matching my pace just out of sight. I didn't stop until I saw the ranger cabin lights through the trees. When I got inside, my radio suddenly came alive, blaring static before dispatch's voice broke through. Unit 4, do you copy? You've been off-grid for over an hour. An hour. I checked my watch. It was 3:42 a.m. I'd been chasing that light for more than 60 minutes, but the spot I'd reached couldn't have been more than 10 minutes down the trail. I didn't tell them everything, just that I'd seen some lights. My supervisor asked if I wanted to file a report, but I said no. I didn't want to sound crazy. A week later, curiosity got the better of me. I went back to that same ridge during daylight, trying to convince myself it had been some optical illusion. But the spot where I'd seen the lantern, the ground was burned. Just a small, perfect circle of blackened earth, right where it had hovered. That area's been off limits again since 2018. Officially, it's due to trail erosion. Unofficially, well, rangers talk. Everyone's seen something there at least once. Lights, whispers, shadows. I transferred out of that park 2 months later. But sometimes when I drive near those mountains at night, I swear I can see a faint orange flicker through the trees, keeping pace with my car, and every time I hear that same rasp of air in the back of my neck, like someone leaning close to remind me, don't follow. The cabin that wasn't there. I used to go backpacking alone a lot. It's something I stopped doing after this happened. After one night deep in the Appalachian backcountry that I can't explain in any rational way. It was October 2019, just before Halloween. The colors were unreal that year. Fiery reds and golds across the hills of Southern Virginia. I had taken 3 days off work and planned a solo hike through a lesser-known section of the Jefferson National Forest. I'd done plenty of solo trips before, so I wasn't nervous about being alone. But I'd never hiked this particular trail. By the time I reached my second campsite, it was already getting dark. The last bit of daylight was fading, and the forest had that eerie quiet that comes after dusk, when every small sound feels louder than it should. I found a flat spot near a stream and pitched my tent. The air smelled like wet leaves and wood smoke from somewhere far away. It must have been around 9:30 p.m. when I first heard it. A sound like wood knocking, 2 sharp hits echoing through the trees. I froze for a second, listening. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far either, maybe a quarter mile off. I'd heard of campers using tree knocks to communicate, but there was no one else for miles according to the logbook I'd signed at the ranger station. I tried to shake it off and went back to boiling water for my freeze-dried meal. Then I heard it again. This time 3 knocks. Knock, knock, knock. Slower. Closer. Something about the rhythm made my skin crawl. I shined my headlamp out into the darkness, calling out, "Hello? Somebody out there?" Nothing. The sound stopped. I forced myself to eat, crawled into my sleeping bag, and tried to ignore the gnawing unease in my stomach. Eventually, I must have drifted off, but sometime later, maybe around 2 a.m., I woke up to something that made my heart stop. There was a light moving through the trees outside my tent. It wasn't a flashlight beam. It was softer, yellowish, like the glow from an oil lamp. I watched its faint flicker through the nylon, moving slowly along the tree line. Then it stopped. For a few seconds, there was silence. Then, the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate crunches in the leaves coming closer. I held my breath. Whoever it was, they were moving quietly. Too quietly for someone just hiking or lost. The light dimmed, then brightened again like it was being covered and uncovered. My hands were shaking as I reached for my knife. "Who's there?" I finally said, my voice trembling. The footsteps stopped. Dead still. Then I heard something I can't forget. A faint, low voice from just outside the tent. "You're not supposed to be here." It sounded flat, emotionless. Male maybe, but something about it was off. Like the words were being repeated, not spoken naturally. I didn't move. Didn't breathe. After maybe 10 seconds, the light started moving away again, back through the trees, fading deeper into the woods. I sat awake until dawn, every nerve in my body screaming to pack up and leave. When daylight finally broke, I stepped out of the tent and scanned the area. No footprints, no sign of anyone. Still, I decided to cut the trip short. I hiked fast, following my map, trying to reach the trailhead by mid-afternoon. That's when I saw it. Something that shouldn't have been there. About halfway down the mountain, just off the trail, there was a cabin. It looked old. Gray wood, sagging roof, no glass in the windows. I was confused because the ranger map showed nothing here. Curiosity got the better of me. I figured maybe it was some abandoned homestead, so I stepped closer. The air around it felt wrong, still colder than the rest of the forest. My boots crunched on the leaves, and the closer I got, the more I noticed how quiet everything was. No birds, no wind. When I reached the porch, I noticed something carved into one of the support beams, 1891. The front door was slightly open, just enough to creak when the wind moved. I called out, "Hello? Anyone in there?" No answer. I pushed the door open with my boot. The inside smelled like rot and dirt. Dust floated in the sunlight through cracks in the roof. There was a single chair in the center of the room, and on it, sitting neatly, was a lantern. It looked exactly like the one I'd seen in the woods the night before, still burning faintly. I froze. My first thought was that maybe a local was squatting here, but the flame wasn't real fire. It glowed steadily, more like light trapped in glass. Then I heard a floorboard creak behind me. I turned fast and no one there. Just that cold air pressing in close. Then I heard the same voice as last night, clearer this time, whispering from somewhere near the back wall. "You're not supposed to be here." Every instinct in my body screamed to run. I backed out of the cabin slowly, not turning my back on it until I was a good 20 feet away. And then I bolted. I didn't stop running until I hit the dirt road that led to the ranger station. When I told the ranger what I'd found, he frowned and said, "Cabin? There's no cabin on that trail. Hasn't been anything built out there in 100 years. I thought maybe I'd been confused, maybe exhaustion had made me imagine it, until he pulled out an old topographical map. Right where I'd marked the location, there was a note printed in faded ink. Burned cabin site, 1891. Apparently, a family had died in a fire there. The story went that hikers sometimes saw lights moving through that part of the forest, or heard voices warning them away. I went back once, a year later, with a friend. Same trail, same stretch of woods, but where the cabin had been, there was nothing. No foundation, no clearing, just trees. We stood there in silence for a while, and I swear I could smell smoke, faint and bitter, even though there wasn't a fire anywhere nearby. When the wind shifted, I heard something faint from deep among the trees, 3 slow knocks, knock, 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 and then that same distant whisper carried on the cold air, "You're not supposed to be here." The thing that crawled out of the creek. This happened in early November of 2017, when I was living with my uncle near the Tennessee-North Carolina border, right in the heart of the Appalachian range. He had this small property, maybe 30 acres of forest with a narrow creek cutting through the back. The place was beautiful but remote. The nearest neighbor was almost a mile away, and cell service was practically non-existent unless you climbed the ridge. I was 19 then, home from college for a break. My uncle was a quiet guy, a Vietnam vet who didn't talk much but loved the land. He'd always warned me not to go wandering too far down the creek after dark. Said the woods got different once the sun went down. I figured it was just one of his old mountain superstitions, and every local seemed to have a few. But I learned pretty quickly he wasn't exaggerating. It started one evening around 10 p.m. My uncle had gone to bed early, and I was sitting out on the back porch, bundled up in a flannel jacket. The night was clear but cold, that kind of still, crisp cold that makes sound travel farther than it should. The only thing I could hear was the slow trickle of the creek and the occasional owl. Then came this sound. It was faint at first, a splash, then another. Like someone was walking through the creek barefoot. I leaned forward, squinting through the dark. The moonlight caught on the water about 30 yards away, but I couldn't see anything moving. I called out, "Uncle Ray, that you?" No answer. I waited a few seconds, listening. The splashing stopped, but then came a sound I'll never forget, a gurgling breath, wet and rattling like someone trying to breathe through water. It came from right down near the bank. I stood up fast, my heart thudding in my chest, trying to convince myself it was some animal. A deer, maybe, or a raccoon. Then, whatever it was, coughed. Not an animal cough. A human one. I grabbed the flashlight sitting beside the door and walked to the edge of the porch. "Who's out there?" I shouted, voice shaking. The beam cut through the darkness, hitting the water. And that's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was a person. A figure crouched in the middle of the creek, bent forward, one hand pressed into the mud. Its skin was pale, so pale it looked almost gray-blue under the light. But the head was wrong. It was tilted too far to the side, like the neck had been broken and never set right. Its hair hung in wet clumps, and as it slowly turned toward me, the light hit its face. There were no eyes, just hollow dark sockets where they should have been. Its mouth opened wide, impossibly wide, and it made that same gurgling breath again as water spilled out from between its teeth. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the porch steps. For a second, I thought I was seeing things, but then it started moving toward me, crawling out of the creek, its limbs jerking like it didn't remember how to use them. I ran inside, slammed the door, and locked it. My uncle came stumbling out of his room, half asleep, shotgun in hand. "What the hell's going on?" he barked. I told him what I saw, or tried to. The words barely came out between breaths. He didn't ask questions, just looked at me with this grim, knowing expression, then said, "Stay inside." He opened the door again, stepped out onto the porch, and fired a round into the darkness. The gunshot echoed through the trees, followed by silence. Then, the splashing started again, farther down the creek this time. My uncle muttered something under his breath, something I couldn't quite make out. Sounded like a prayer or a warning, then closed the door and set the gun down. "It won't come near the house," he said, voice low. "Not tonight." I wanted to ask what he meant, but he didn't say another word. We stayed awake till morning, listening. Once or twice I thought I heard something moving around outside. Slow, dragging footsteps circling the porch. But when dawn broke, it was quiet again. The next day I went down to the creek against his advice. The mud along the bank was disturbed, deep grooves where something had crawled out of the water. There were handprints too, human-shaped, but longer. When I showed him, he just said, "Told you not to go down there." That evening, over coffee, I pressed him for answers. He finally sighed and told me that years ago, before he bought the land, there'd been a small mining camp upstream. One night, a flood hit the valley and half the workers drowned in that creek. Locals said their bodies were never recovered, and some nights, especially after heavy rain, you could still hear them crawling back out. I laughed nervously, trying to dismiss it, but I couldn't stop thinking about the way that thing had moved, jerky and wrong, like bones grinding together. The night before I left, I woke up around 2:45 a.m. to a faint tapping on the window beside my bed. Slow, rhythmic. Tap, tap, tap. When I looked, I saw a wet handprint sliding down the glass. I didn't move until sunrise. Now, whenever I visit that area, I won't go near the creek, not even in daylight, because the last thing my uncle told me before he passed away still echoes in my head. They don't drown easy in these mountains. Voices by the Fire Tower. This happened back in October 2015, when I worked as a seasonal ranger assistant in the Blue Ridge section of the Appalachians. My main responsibility was to help maintain the old fire towers, those tall, skeletal structures that used to be manned decades ago before cameras took over. There was one tower in particular, Hollow Point, that everyone hated being assigned to. It stood on a steep ridge surrounded by deep forest, a half-hour drive from the nearest paved road. The structure was old. Half the steps were rusted out, and it creaked when the wind blew. Locals had all kinds of stories about it. One said a ranger went missing there in the 80s and was never found. Another claimed the tower's radio still picked up voices after dark, even though it hadn't been connected to any network in years. I didn't believe any of it, until the night I had to stay there alone. Setup, context: it was October 28th, right before Halloween weekend. A storm had been rolling through all day, and we were worried lightning might have hit the tower. My supervisor, a guy named David, asked if I could drive out to check the structure and make sure no hikers had taken shelter inside. It was late, around 8:45 p.m., and still drizzling when I started the drive. The gravel road twisted endlessly through the woods, my truck headlights cutting through heavy fog that clung to the trees. The radio kept fading in and out with static. Every few minutes I'd see the reflection of deer eyes flash on the side of the road, but otherwise, it was just me and the hum of the engine. When I finally reached the gate at the trailhead, I parked, grabbed my flashlight, and started the half-mile hike up the path to the tower. The air smelled like wet bark and iron from the storm, and the forest was unnaturally quiet. When I reached the clearing, the tower loomed above me, tall, black against the mist, the cabin at the top barely visible in the moonlight, buildup of tension. The door at the base was unlocked. Inside was the old radio station, just a rusted desk, some broken equipment, and a steel ladder bolted to the frame leading upward. I climbed slowly, testing each step, the metal groaning under my weight. At the top, I opened the hatch and pulled myself into the observation cabin. The smell hit me first, musty, stale, like wet insulation. The windows were fogged, but I could see flashes of lightning far off in the distance. I set my flashlight on the table, checked the wiring for damage, and was about to head back down when I noticed the radio. It was an old transceiver, the kind with analog dials and a cracked microphone. The weird thing was, and it was still powered on. I could hear a faint hiss of static. I thought maybe the batteries had shorted, so I reached to turn it off. But as my hand touched the dial, the static changed. A voice crackled through. It was faint, distorted, but definitely human. "Hello? Anyone copy?" My heart skipped. The nearest ranger station was 30 miles away. Maybe someone was out here lost? I grabbed the mic and replied, "This is Hollow Point Outpost. Identify yourself over static." Then after a few seconds, "Don't come down." That's all it said. The voice sounded distant, hollow, like someone whispering through a tunnel. I repeated my message, asked for location. Nothing but static again. I stepped back from the desk, my flashlight beam flickering against the metal walls. The storm outside was getting worse. The wind howled through the tower frame, making the whole structure vibrate slightly. Then, I heard footsteps. Slow, heavy steps on the ladder below. I froze. It wasn't the metal creaking randomly. It was distinct, one step after another, like someone was climbing up. "David?" I called down. No answer. The footsteps stopped. I leaned over the hatch, shining my light down the ladder. The beam cut through the darkness, but the lower rungs were empty. "Hello?" I said again. Nothing. Just the sound of rain pelting the roof and the wind pushing against the structure. I pulled back and shut the hatch, sliding the bolt lock across. My breathing had gotten fast, fogging up the glass around me. I tried the radio again, whispering, "Who's down there?" Static. Then the same voice returned, closer this time, clearer. "Don't come down." That's when I realized the voice wasn't coming from the radio anymore. It was coming from outside the window. Climax, horror moment. I turned, flashlight trembling in my hand. Something was pressed against the glass, like a pale face, eyes wide open, unmoving. It stared straight at me, its mouth slightly open like it was trying to form words. I screamed and stumbled back. The face didn't move. I blinked, and it was gone. The tower creaked violently as if something had slammed into the base below. I could feel it shaking. Then came the sound of metal scraping, hands or claws dragging along the outer frame, moving upward. The noise circled the tower, slow and deliberate, until it reached the roof. I could hear footsteps directly above me now, heavy, shifting the old planks. My heart was hammering so hard I thought I'd pass out. I grabbed the radio again, yelling into it, "Base! Hollow Point! I need backup right now, static." Then the voice and my own voice were repeated back perfectly. "I need backup right now." That was enough. I unlocked the hatch and climbed down as fast as I could, nearly missing a rung in the dark. I didn't care if I fell, I just needed to get out. The whole time I could still hear movement above, matching my pace. When I reached the bottom, I sprinted through the clearing toward the trail. The rain had turned into a downpour, soaking me instantly. I didn't stop running until I hit the truck, slammed the door, and locked it. Aftermath, open end eye. Radioed David again once I got a signal. He said he hadn't sent anyone else out that night. I was supposed to be the only one. The next morning, I went back with 2 other rangers. The tower was empty. No footprints, no signs of anyone having been there. But when we checked the top cabin, something was waiting on the desk. The old radio mic. Wrapped tightly around it was a length of wet, dark hair, as if someone had left it there deliberately. I never went back to Hollow Point after that. A few months later, the tower was officially closed off for structural safety concerns. But sometimes, late at night when the wind's right, hikers on that ridge still report hearing faint radio chatter coming from the trees. Always the same phrase over and over in a broken whisper. Don't come down. The thing that watched from the ridge. This happened in the fall of 2018 when I worked as a wildlife surveyor for a small environmental firm in North Carolina. We were studying deer populations and habitat, density in one of the most remote Appalachian ranges I've ever been in, an area about 20 miles from any paved road. Our team was just me and another guy named Chris. We'd been friends since college, and we both loved the outdoors, the kind of people who felt at home miles from civilization. But that changed after the second night on that ridge. Setup, context, we'd been hiking all day, setting up trail cameras along game paths. The forest there was thick, so thick you could barely see 20 feet ahead. The trees grew close together, the ground blanketed in wet leaves and moss. By the time we reached the ridge we were supposed to camp on, it was already 5:30 p.m., and the sky had turned that dull silver color that comes right before twilight. The ridge overlooked a narrow valley, with the creek below glinting through the trees. The view was beautiful, but something about the place felt heavy. You know that feeling when the woods suddenly go quiet? No birds, no bugs? And your body just knows something's wrong? That's how it felt. We set up camp anyway. By 7 p.m. the fire was going. Our tents were up and we were cooking canned chili on a small stove. Chris joked about how creepy the forest felt, said it was Blair Witch vibes. I laughed it off, but I was already uneasy. At 9:45 p.m., while we were sitting by the fire, we both heard it, a long, low whistle from somewhere beyond the tree line. Not a bird, not a person either. It was too drawn out, too deliberate. Chris turned to me, eyes wide. "You hear that?" "Yeah," I said. "Probably just wind." "Wind doesn't do that," he muttered. We listened for a while, but it didn't come again. Still, neither of us felt much like talking after that. The fire burned low, and by 11:30 we decided to turn in. Build-up of tension. I remember waking up sometime after 2 a.m. to the sound of movement outside. At first I thought it was Chris getting up to take a leak. But then I heard it again, soft footsteps moving in circles around the tents. Slow, deliberate. I whispered, "Chris?" "You awake?" From the other tent he whispered back, "Yeah, you hear that too?" We both went silent, listening. The steps stopped. Then came the sound of breathing, and heavy, wet breathing, like someone exhaling through a half-clogged throat. Chris unzipped his tent just a few inches, and I heard him hiss quietly, "Jesus Christ." "What?" I whispered. "Look at the ridge." I crawled out and peeked through the flap of my tent. The campfire had died down to faint embers, but there was just enough moonlight to see the outline of the ridge across the clearing, and standing there, maybe 40 feet away, was a figure, tall, thin, perfectly still. Its skin looked pale, almost gray against the dark trees. It wasn't moving, but it was facing directly toward us, watching. Chris whispered, "Maybe it's a hunter." But no hunter I've ever met stands like that, motionless, silent, unblinking. We waited, barely breathing. After a minute, the figure started to move, not walking exactly, more like it was gliding down the ridge toward us. The way it moved didn't make sense. Its limbs bent strangely, too long, the joints flexing the wrong way. That's when I lost it. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it straight at the thing. For half a second I saw its face, if you can call it that. The skin was stretched too tight, the eyes sunken deep, the mouth open in what looked like a silent scream. It ducked behind a tree the instant the light hit it. Chris shouted, "Get in the truck!" We ran, grabbed what we could, and bolted down the trail toward the pickup parked about a quarter-mile away. The forest was dead silent except for our boots pounding the dirt. Then from somewhere behind us that same whistle echoed through the trees, long and low, almost mocking. Climax. Horror moment. We reached the truck, breathless and shaking. Chris fumbled with the keys, dropped them once, cursed, then finally got the door open. As we slammed the door shut, the headlights caught something moving at the tree line. The figure was standing there again, halfway between the trees. But this time it was closer, no more than 20 feet away. Its head tilted slowly to the side, unnaturally far. Then it crouched, almost like an animal, and started crawling toward us on all fours, and Chris floored it. The tires spun in mud before catching, and we tore down that dirt road faster than I thought the truck could handle. Branches scraped the windows, rocks slammed the undercarriage. In the rearview mirror, I saw flashes of pale movement darting between the trees, keeping pace with us for a few seconds, then gone. We didn't stop until we hit the ranger station at dawn. Aftermath, open end. The ranger on duty, an older guy named Tom, looked at us like we were crazy when we told him what happened. But when we mentioned the ridge, he went quiet. People don't camp up there anymore, he said finally. Used to be an old homestead. Family disappeared back in the 60s. Locals say something still walks that ridge. We tried to find our gear later that day, but when we hiked back, the campsite was gone. Not disturbed, gone. No sign of a fire pit, no footprints, no tents. Like we'd never been there. The weirdest part? The ground where we'd camped looked freshly burned. Just a black circular patch of earth about 20 feet wide, still warm to the touch. Chris quit the job a week later. Moved to Florida. He never talks about it. Sometimes when I'm working late in the woods, I still think about that thing, how it didn't chase us, didn't attack, just watched. And when the wind blows just right through the trees, I swear I can hear that same whistle again, drifting through the ridges of the mountains, slow and steady. Whew, like it's still out there, watching. The Woman Under the Bridge. I grew up in southwestern Virginia, right on the edge of the Appalachian foothills. It's a quiet part of the state. Endless trees, winding back roads, and forgotten towns that seem frozen in time. This story happened in the summer of 2019, when I was working part-time for the county road maintenance crew. We were the guys who filled potholes, cleared branches, and checked on old bridges after heavy rain. Most of the time it was boring, routine work, until the night I got assigned to the old stone bridge near Hollow Creek. It's one of those spots locals quietly avoid after dark. No one really says why, but everyone seems to know something's wrong with that place. Setup, context, it was July 12th, hot and muggy, the kind of air that sticks to your skin. A thunderstorm had rolled through that afternoon and washed out half the back roads, so my supervisor asked if I could check the creek crossings before the night shift ended. I didn't mind. It was around 11:30 p.m. when I reached Hollow Creek Bridge. The rain had stopped, but fog clung to the ground in thick patches, glowing faintly in my headlights. The bridge itself was old, built sometime in the 1920s, made of gray stone, narrow enough for only one car at a time. Beneath it, the creek ran slow and shallow, reflecting the moon like a strip of dull glass. When I stepped out of the truck, the night felt heavy, the kind of quiet that presses on your eardrums. Even the frogs were silent. I grabbed my flashlight and clipboard, checked the guardrails, then crouched to look under the bridge. There was some debris stuck against the supports. Tree limbs, trash, maybe an old tire. Pretty normal after a storm. That's when I heard humming. Soft, slow, almost like a lullaby. It was coming from directly under the bridge. Build-up of tension at first. I thought maybe it was a radio left in one of the cars that got swept down there before, but when I leaned closer, the sound stopped. I shone my flashlight down the embankment. The beam hit the muddy creek bed, shimmering on the water. Nothing there. Then the humming started again. Louder this time, closer. It was a woman's voice. Low, melodic, and broken in places, like she was humming through cracked lips. "Hello?" I called out. "Is someone down there?" No answer. The only sound was the water trickling through the rocks. I hesitated, then slowly made my way down the embankment, boots slipping in the wet mud. The air smelled like wet earth and something faintly metallic, like old blood. As I got closer to the underside of the bridge, I noticed something strange. There were handprints smeared on the stone. Muddy ones, dozens of them, pressed up along the inner wall, small, delicate hands, like a woman's. Some of the prints were fresh enough to glisten under my light. I should have gone back to the truck right then, but I was trained to check for trapped people or flood victims, and my mind kept telling me maybe someone needed help. So I called again. "Ma'am, are you hurt?" That's when something moved behind one of the stone supports. A shadow, quick and fluid. My light caught a flash of white, maybe fabric, maybe skin. Then it disappeared back into the darkness. The humming started again, but now it was off-key, slow and dragging. It didn't sound human anymore. I felt the hair rise on the back of my neck. My heart started pounding so loud I could hear it echo off the bridge walls. "Ma'am." I tried again, but my voice cracked halfway through. This time there was an answer, a whisper right behind me. "Do you know the song?" Climax, horror moment. I spun around, nearly dropping the flashlight. The beam shook wildly across the stones and the water, and there she was, standing knee-deep in the creek, just a few feet from where I'd come down. She looked like a woman in her mid-30s, wearing a soaked white dress that clung to her skin. Her hair was long, dark, and dripping wet, covering half her face. The parts of her I could see were grayish pale, like she'd been underwater too long. Her mouth was open, lips trembling, but her eyes, they were wrong. Black, completely black, like two holes burned into her face. She tilted her head slowly the way a curious animal does. "Do you know it?" she asked again, her voice wet and gurgling. I froze. Couldn't breathe. Couldn't speak. She started to hum again, that same broken lullaby, and stepped closer, the water rippling around her legs. I stumbled backward, slipping on the mud. My flashlight dropped and rolled toward the creek, the beam catching her feet. That's when I noticed she wasn't standing in the water. Her feet weren't touching the ground at all. She was hovering just an inch. Above it, I don't remember what happened next except running, scrambling up the embankment, tearing through the brush and throwing myself into the truck. My hands were shaking so hard I barely got the key in the ignition. As soon as the headlights came on, I saw her again, right in front of the truck. She was standing in the middle of the bridge now, staring at me. The fog swirled around her, her wet dress moving like it was underwater. Then she smiled, and it wasn't human. It stretched too wide, too slow, like her mouth was being pulled apart from the inside. I slammed the gas pedal and the truck shot forward. For a split second I thought I hit her, but there was nothing. The bridge was empty. Aftermath. Open-end, I drove straight back to the service station, locked the doors, and sat there until dawn. I didn't tell anyone what I'd seen that night, not even my supervisor. Just said the bridge was clear. But a week later, one of the other guys, Jerry Xiao, was sent to inspect Hollow Creek Bridge again. He came back pale as a ghost. Said he found wet footprints leading up from the creek across the bridge and stopping right in the middle of the road. Bare feet, small ones. He joked about it at first, but he wouldn't go back there alone again. None of us would. I quit that job the following year. But every time I drive through that part of Virginia, I make sure to take the long way around, even if it adds an hour to the trip. Because sometimes late at night when the fog rolls in, you can still hear someone humming under that old bridge. And if you stop and listen too long, you might hear her whisper, "Do you know the song?" The cabin with no door. This happened in October 2021, deep in the mountains of West Virginia, where my family owns a few hundred acres of woodland. We use it mostly for hunting and camping, though after what I saw that weekend, I haven't gone back once. I've always loved those woods. They're quiet, untouched, and the air smells like pine and damp earth. But there's a part of the property, a steep valley behind the North Ridge, that no one in my family ever goes near. My grandfather used to call it Hollow Bend. When I was younger, I asked him why, and he'd just shake his head and say, "That place doesn't want us there." I used to think it was just one of his old mountain sayings. But after that night, I finally understood what he meant. Set up Kari's context, it was October 23rd, just before Halloween. I'd taken a few days off work and gone up to the cabin alone, something I'd done plenty of times before. It's a small hand-built place with no electricity and a wood stove for heat. I brought my rifle, a few cans of food, and my dog, Jasper. The first 2 days were uneventful. I spent my mornings scouting deer trails and my evenings sitting by the fire, listening to the wind through the trees. But on the third night, something changed. Around 11:15 p.m., I heard Jasper growling. Not the playful kind. The low, deep growl that rumbles through a dog's chest when it senses something it doesn't like. I looked out the window, but all I could see was the forest and a faint line of fog rolling through the trees. Then from somewhere in that fog came a thump. Then another. It sounded like someone hitting a hollow log with a heavy stick. Rhythmic. Deliberate, getting closer. I stepped outside with my flashlight and called out, "Who's out there?" The sound stopped. The woods went completely still. No crickets, no wind, and nothing. I stayed outside for a minute or two, scanning the trees before finally going back in. Jasper wouldn't leave the door, though. He just sat there staring, ears up, tail stiff. I figured maybe a bear had wandered close, but that didn't explain what I saw the next morning. Build-up of tension, I woke up early, around 6:30 a.m., and stepped outside to check for tracks. The ground was wet with dew, so any prints would show clearly. Sure enough, I found them. A trail of bare footprints in the mud leading away from the cabin. They weren't mine. They were smaller. Narrow. Like a woman's feet. And they led downhill. Straight toward Hollow Bend. I don't know what possessed me to follow them. But curiosity won over common sense. Jasper trailed behind me, tail low, whining softly. The prints led about half a mile down the ridge before ending in front of something I'd never seen before. A cabin. It was old, older than anything else on the property. The logs were gray and split, the roof sagging under years of moss and leaves. Vines crawled up the walls and the windows were nothing but jagged holes. But the strangest part, and I swear to God this is true, was that the cabin had no door. There was a frame for one, but the space was filled with solid wood. Like the doorway had been sealed shut from the inside. No way in, no way out. Jasper started barking then, backing away, hackles raised. I felt the air around us shift, colder, heavier. Like the forest itself was holding its breath. Then came that same thump from the night before. This time it was close. Too close. It came from inside the cabin. Thump, thump, thump. Something was hitting the wall from the inside. Slow, steady, almost like knocking. I whispered, "Hello?" Before realizing how stupid that was, the knocking stopped. Then from behind the wooden wall I heard something drag across the floor. Heavy. Wet. Jasper bolted, tearing back up the trail toward our cabin. I wasn't far behind. Climax horror moment. That night I barricaded the door and kept my rifle close. I tried to tell myself I'd imagined it, that maybe wind or animals had caused those sounds. But around 2:40 a.m. Jasper started whining again. And then, clear as day, I heard it. The same thump on my cabin wall, 3 times. Slow and even, then silence. I didn't move, didn't breathe. I sat in the dark, gun in my lap, every muscle in my body tight. The second set of knocks came from the opposite side of the cabin. Then another from the back wall. It was circling me, whatever it was. It was walking around the outside, hitting the walls as it went. Finally, it stopped and right beside the window, and I heard a voice, a woman's voice. Soft, low, muffled through the wood. "Let me in." My blood ran cold. Jasper whimpered and crawled under the bed. "Please," she whispered again. "It's cold out here." I wanted to look to see if someone was really there, but I couldn't. My body just froze. Every instinct screamed at me not to open that curtain. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the voice stopped, but the thumping started again, this time from inside the cabin, behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing there. No one, just darkness. The air was thick with the smell of damp wood and something foul, rot maybe, or stagnant water. I backed toward the corner, heart pounding so hard it felt like it was shaking the floor. Then, slowly, the wall across from me began to bulge inward, like something was pressing against it from outside. The boards creaked, dust falling from the ceiling, and faintly, beneath the cracking wood, I heard it again. Thump, then a whisper, "Let me in." Aftermath, open end. I must have passed out at some point, because when I woke up, sunlight was coming through the window. The air was still, silent, and Jasper was sitting by the door again, staring outside. When I stepped out, I saw something that made my stomach twist. a set of bare footprints in the mud leading away from my cabin. They went straight back toward Hollow Bend. I left that morning, didn't even pack half my things. A week later, I called the county records office to ask about the old cabin. The woman on the phone told me there used to be one down in that valley. Belonged to a family named Garnett who vanished sometime in the 1940s. When searchers went looking for them, all they found was the cabin sealed up tight. No door, no windows, no sign of anyone inside. The locals said the Garnetts were taken, that the Woods built that cabin around them to keep something in, or to keep something out, I don't know. Which is worse, I haven't been back since. But sometimes when I'm home alone and the night gets too quiet, I swear I can still hear it, that soft, hollow thump, coming from somewhere deep in the walls, and a voice that whispers, "It's cold out here." The lights in the hollow. I grew up in southern Kentucky near the Tennessee border, where the mountains fold into one another like dark waves. Most people around here stick close to the main roads. Once you get into the hollers, cell service vanishes. And the old-timers say you can lose more than just your signal out there. This story happened to me and my cousin Derek back in November of 2020, when we decided to go night hiking through an area locals call Raven's Hollow. It was supposed to be an adventure, two grown men reliving their teenage stupidity. But what we saw out there still wakes me up at night. And if you ever find yourself driving down those empty back roads near Pine Ridge after dark, and you see a strange light in the woods, don't follow it. Set up context. Raven's Hollow is a place most locals won't even mention after sunset. There are dozens of stories about it. Lights that float between the trees, voices that call your name, and hunters who walk in and never come out. But I never believed in any of that. I've spent half my life camping and hunting those hills, and I've seen enough wildlife to know how easily shadows can trick the eyes. That night, we got to the trailhead around 9 p.m. It was cold, around 40 degrees, and fog was starting to roll in from the creek. The moon was hidden behind clouds, so our flashlights barely cut through the darkness. Derek was filming on his phone, joking about ghost lights in the hollow for his YouTube channel. I remember laughing and saying, "If we find ghosts, I'm charging them rent." We hiked for maybe a mile when we first saw it. A light down in the trees. At first, it looked like a flashlight, white, steady, moving slowly through the woods parallel to the trail, but there was something off about it. It wasn't bouncing like a handheld light would. It just glided smooth and silent. "Probably a hunter," Derek said. "Out here? At 9:30 at night?" I asked. That's when the second light appeared, a little further back, hovering maybe 5 feet off the ground. Then another, 3 of them now, drifting through the hollow like glowing lanterns, moving in perfect unison, buildup of tension. We killed our flashlights and crouched down behind a fallen log. The air felt colder suddenly, sharp, biting. The woods had gone deathly quiet. The lights moved closer, weaving between the trees. They weren't flickering or swaying like fire, just floating. Every now and then, one would drift behind a tree trunk and vanish for a second before reappearing. I whispered. Derek filmed this. He raised his phone, trying to zoom in, but the lights seemed to react. They stopped moving altogether. We waited, breath held, then one by one they started rising, slowly vertically until they were hovering 20, maybe 30 feet above the ground. And that's when we realized something that made my blood go cold. They weren't floating in front of the trees. They were inside them. The trunks of those old oaks were glowing from within, like the light was pulsing through the wood itself. "What the hell?" Derek whispered. Then from somewhere down the hollow came a faint humming sound, deep, rhythmic, like a massive tuning fork vibrating through the air. The lights began to move again, circling, faster now, creating trails of dim light between the trees. The hum grew louder, and I swear to God the ground beneath us started to tremble. Derek whispered, "We should go." But before we could stand, something behind us snapped. A sharp crack, like a branch breaking under heavy weight. I turned my flashlight on. The beam landed on something pale crouched behind a boulder maybe 20 feet away. At first I thought it was an animal, until it stood up. Climax. Horror moment. It was a man. Or at least it looked like one, but his body was wrong. Too long, too thin, his clothes hanging off him in tatters. His skin was colorless, almost translucent in the light, and his face, it didn't have eyes, just smooth stretched skin where they should have been. He tilted his head toward us like he could feel our gaze. Then behind him more lights started to appear, dozens this time, glowing through the fog surrounding him. The hum was so loud now I could feel it in my chest. My vision blurred like my eyes couldn't focus on what I was seeing. The eyeless man opened his mouth, wide, impossibly wide, and a sound came out that wasn't human. A low, vibrating tone that made my teeth ache. Derek screamed. I grabbed him and we ran. The woods exploded with movement, the lights following us, darting between trees, cutting through the fog. Every few seconds one would flash right in front of us, so bright it burned my vision white. The humming turned into something else, a distorted mix of whispers and moans, overlapping, echoing all around us. It sounded like voices trapped underwater. We hit the main trail, half blind, and didn't stop until we saw the glint of my truck headlights through the trees. When we finally slammed the door shut, the radio came on by itself, blasting static so loud it nearly blew the speakers. Through the static, I swear I heard something whisper our names, then it cut off. Aftermath, an open end, we drove back to town in silence. Derek deleted the footage that same night, said the video was glitching so badly it froze his phone, and when he managed to play it back, all he could hear was that low humming sound. I didn't believe him until I checked my dash cam the next day. When I reviewed the footage, the camera froze for exactly 3 minutes, right around the time we would have been in the hollow. The only thing that recorded during that time was a faint, pulsating glow through the windshield. Every few seconds the audio would distort, and you could hear what sounded like breathing. A week later, Derek moved to Ohio, said he didn't feel safe in the mountains anymore. I tried to laugh it off, to convince myself we'd seen swamp gas or drones or some kind of natural phenomenon. But part of me knows better. Last winter I was driving that same back road late one night, around 2:30 a.m., when I saw it again. A single white light, floating through the trees near Raven's Hollow, and this time it didn't move away. It followed my truck for almost a mile, matching my speed, hovering just beyond the tree line. Then, right before the road curved, it flickered once and disappeared. I don't go near that part of Kentucky anymore. But sometimes when the night's real still, I'll hear that same faint humming through the hills, and I know somewhere out there in the dark hollow, those lights are still moving, waiting for someone else to follow them in. The Voices from the Mine. I live in southwestern Virginia, near the edge of what used to be coal country. Around here, old mines are as common as creeks, dark holes carved into the mountains decades ago, most of them sealed up or forgotten. This story happened in the winter of 2017, when I was working as a surveyor for a small mining company. Our job was to map out abandoned shafts and test for possible methane leaks before any restoration projects could begin. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. One of those shafts, the one near Gun Hollow, is the reason I quit that job for good. Because there are things down there that don't sound like echoes. Setup. Context: it was January 14th, bitterly cold and around 22 Kattger, when my partner Mike and I arrived at the old Gun Hollow mine. It hadn't been operational since the mid-1950s, but the county wanted to install warning fencing and new air vents to prevent gas buildup. The mine entrance sat halfway up a hill, hidden by dead brush and snow. You could still see the rusted rail tracks leading in, disappearing into blackness. Our goal was simple: check the first 200 yards of the main tunnel, measure gas levels, and photograph structural integrity. We carried headlamps, respirators, and handheld CO2 meters. Standard procedure. At first, everything was quiet, just the crunch of boots and the distant drip of melting ice. But about 50 yards in, the air changed. It got warmer, thicker, and there was this faint smell. Something between rust and rot. I mentioned it to Mike, but he just shrugged. Probably trapped air. Mines do that. By 12:30 p.m. we were deep inside, far enough that daylight had vanished completely. The tunnel walls were lined with timber braces blackened from age, and water trickled down in steady drips that echoed through the dark. Then the detector started beeping. Not fast, just one slow, steady tone every few seconds. That usually meant rising carbon dioxide, but the reading was odd. It wasn't consistent. Mike frowned. That's weird. It's fluctuating. I was about to suggest turning back when we both heard it, faint, distant, coming from deeper in the mine, a voice. Build-up of tension, it sounded like someone calling out. A man's voice, hello? We froze. It came again, clearer this time, echoing faintly down the tunnel. Can you hear me? Mike raised his light toward the darkness ahead. Someone else down here? He whispered. That can't be, I said. We locked the gate behind us. We waited, listening. For a few seconds there was nothing. Then the sound of footsteps, faint but distinct, splashing lightly through puddles deeper in the shaft. Mike called out. Hey! Who's there? This area's closed off. No reply. The footsteps stopped. Then we heard breathing, slow, heavy, just beyond the reach of our lights. Mike took a few cautious steps forward, shining his beam down the tunnel. The light reached maybe 50 feet ahead before getting swallowed by the blackness. Probably an echo, he muttered, though he didn't sound convinced. We kept moving, slower now. The walls seemed to close in the deeper we went, the timber beams creaking softly overhead. Every sound, and our boots, our breathing, came back distorted, like the mine was whispering it back in a different voice. And then that voice called out again, but this time, it wasn't asking for help, it was mimicking. I heard my own voice echoing from the darkness ahead, repeating what I'd said just a few seconds earlier. Probably an echo, it whispered. In the exact tone I'd used, I felt every hair on my neck stand up. Mike looked at me, eyes wide. Tell me you heard that. Before I could answer, the sound came again. A perfect imitation of his voice this time, soft and drawn out. Who's there? Climax horror moment. We both backed up fast. Mike dropped his CO2 meter. It clattered against the stone and rolled into the dark. He bent to grab it, and that's when the lights flickered. For a split second, my headlamp flashed across something in the darkness. A figure, pale, half-naked, crouched low to the ground. Its arms were too long, hands splayed on the tunnel floor, and its face. God, I wish I hadn't seen its face. It wasn't a face at all. Just smooth skin stretched where eyes and a mouth should have been. But when our lights hit it, it smiled. Not with a mouth, with movement like the skin rippled outward in the shape of one. Then the lights died completely. The pitch-black silence that followed was unbearable. I could hear Mike's breathing quicken, hear my own heart slamming in my ears. Somewhere in the dark, something began to whisper. Soft, broken, impossible to understand. But every few seconds it slipped in words I recognized. Our names, our phrases, repeating them back in fragments. Help. Can you, Mike? Probably an echo. It was coming closer. I grabbed Mike's arm and pulled him backward, half dragging him as we stumbled toward the entrance. Our boots splashed through puddles. Something brushed my leg, slick and cold. And then, a scream. Not human. It was like metal tearing, deep and sharp, echoing through the shaft so loud it felt like it was inside my skull. We ran. I don't even remember how we found the exit, just the burst of cold air on my face when we finally saw daylight again. When we looked back, the darkness at the mouth of the mine didn't look right. It wasn't just shadow, it was moving, pulsing faintly like something breathing just beyond the light. Aftermath. Open end, we didn't report what we saw. We just said the readings were unstable and recommended sealing the tunnel. A week later, the company welded a metal gate over the entrance and filled it with concrete. I made sure to never go near that place again. But here's the part that still keeps me awake. 2 months later, Mike stopped coming to work. When I finally called his wife, she said he'd been having nightmares, waking up in the middle of the night, saying he could hear voices calling his name through the floorboards. Then one morning he just disappeared. His truck was found parked near Gun Hollow. The gate to the mine was still sealed, untouched, but his footprints led straight to it, and there, right in front of the concrete, the snow was melted in a perfect circle, about 6 feet wide. The state police never found him. Sometimes, when I'm out in the hills alone and the wind tunnels through the ravines just right, I can still hear that sound. Faint. Almost human, whispering through the trees. It always starts the same way. A man's voice calling out, "Hello? Can you hear me?" Whistling Hollow Road. I grew up in eastern Kentucky, not far from the West Virginia line, a place of dense forests, narrow dirt roads, and hollers so deep you lose cell signal before you even hit the first curve. The one that haunts me most is called Whistling Hollow Road. It's not on any map you'll find today, but back in 2012 it was the shortcut everyone used to get from town to the old quarry. A winding, single-lane road that ran between two steep ridges and ended near a collapsed bridge. They say people went missing there back in the 70s, but I never believed those stories, not until the night I drove it alone. Set up context: it was October 27, 2012, a few days before Halloween. I was 19, working late at a feed store in Pikeville. My shift ended around 1:15 a.m., and instead of taking the highway home, I decided to cut through Whistling Hollow, mostly because it shaved 20 minutes off the drive. I'd driven it dozens of times during the day, but never at night. The road had no lights, and the trees on both sides leaned in so close they formed a tunnel of black. The first few miles were uneventful. Just the hum of my old Ford Ranger and the crunch of gravel beneath the tires. Then around 1:40 a.m. I started hearing it, a soft, distant whistling. It was faint, a slow rising tune that carried on the cold wind, like someone whistling a lullaby far off in the woods. At first, I figured it was air slipping through the trees, or maybe an owl. But as I drove further, it got louder. And it wasn't random. It was a melody. Something about it was wrong. Too human to be nature, too deliberate to be the wind. Then my radio, which I'd left off, clicked on by itself. The speakers crackled, and for half a second, I thought I heard the same whistling sound coming through the static. I turned the volume down, but the whistling outside kept going. Closer now. That was when my headlights caught something up ahead. Build-up of tension. At first, I thought it was a person, someone standing in the middle of the road. But when I slowed down, I saw that it wasn't standing. It was rocking. A figure, pale and thin, swaying side to side in the beam of my headlights. It looked like a man in an old brown coat, head tilted downward, whistling softly. I rolled down my window just an inch and called out, "Hey, you all right?" The whistling stopped. The figure turned its head slightly. Not all the way, just enough that I could see a portion of its face. The skin was grayish, stretched tight like parchment, and his eyes looked cloudy and wet. Then he smiled, and a strange, small, twitching smile, and began to whistle again. The same haunting tune. Something about it made my stomach twist. I threw the truck in reverse, tires crunching gravel. But as I backed up, the man started walking toward me slowly, keeping the same rhythm with every step. The sound of that whistling echoed through the trees, circling me. It didn't make sense. It sounded like it was coming from behind me now, too. I slammed the truck into drive and floored it, speeding past him. For a moment, my headlights swept across his body, and that's when I saw his legs. They weren't right. His knees bent the wrong way. Climax, horror moment. I drove fast, way too fast for that kind of road, until I reached the old bridge, the one that had collapsed years ago. The barricade sign came out of nowhere, and I hit the brakes just in time. Stopping inches from the edge, I was panting, heart pounding so loud it drowned out everything, until I realized the night had gone completely silent. No wind, no crickets, not even the sound of my idling engine. Then somewhere behind me, the whistling started again. Low, slow, right behind the truck. I didn't turn around. I just sat there, gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles hurt. The sound grew louder, like whoever was doing it was standing just outside the driver's side window. That was when I heard a voice, soft and broken, almost like it was right inside my ear. "Why'd you stop, boy?" I finally turned, and there he was. Not outside, inside. The man was sitting in the passenger seat, close enough that I could see every crack in his skin. His coat was soaked through, dripping onto my seat, and his eyes looked like two marbles of cloudy glass. He smiled, that same twitching, unnatural grin, and tilted his head as he started to whistle again. My body moved before my brain did. I threw open the door, stumbled out, and bolted down the road. I didn't stop until I hit the tree line, crouching low behind a fallen log. I could see my truck idling by the bridge, headlights cutting across the trees. Then slowly, I watched as the passenger door opened and on its own, and the man stepped out. Only now, there were two of him. The second one crawled out from under the truck. Same clothes, same twisted limbs. Both of them turned toward the woods and toward me and started walking. Still whistling, Aftermath, open-end he ran. I don't remember how far or how long. Just branches whipping my face and the sound of whistling chasing me through the dark until I tripped and hit my head on a rock. When I woke up, it was morning. I was lying in a ditch by the side of the main highway, miles away from where the bridge should have been. My truck was gone. Police found it 3 days later, abandoned by the collapsed bridge. The keys were still in the ignition. They told me it was probably vandals who took it there, but they couldn't explain why the front seat was soaked, or why the windshield had been fogged from the inside, with words traced into it that read, "Don't stop when you hear the whistling. That road's blocked off now, overgrown and forgotten. Locals say if you go there after midnight you can still hear it, that faint haunting tune drifting through the trees. And sometimes if the wind's right, it's not just one person whistling. It's two."